Of course, here is an engaging introduction for your story, designed to set the stage, introduce the themes, and draw the reader into the world of Corporal Elias Vance before the first chapter begins. There are places on Earth where God and the devil seem to have fought to a standstill, and then simply walked away, leaving the battlefield to bleach under the sun. The Al-Kharid Valley in Iraq is one of those places. It is a land of baked earth and brittle bone, a landscape carved by 1,000 years of wind and 100 years of war. The air itself feels ancient, heavy with the dust of forgotten empires, shattered pottery, and spent brass. It's a place that gets into your lungs and under your skin, a fine grit that works its way into the soul, abrading the soft parts of you until all that's left is what can endure. My name is Corporal Elias Vance, and for 112 days, that valley was my world. I was a boy from a place of rolling green hills and the smell of rain on hot asphalt, a place where faith was a comfortable Sunday morning certainty. In Al-Kharid, those memories became a kind of torture, like remembering a feast during a famine. The sun was not a giver of life, but an executioner's glare, and the only green the first ever saw was on the faded camouflage of the man next to me. Every soldier who deploys to a place like that carries something with them, a talisman to ward off the encroaching madness. For some, it's a worn photograph of a smiling girl. For others, it's the gallows humor that turns tragedy into a punchline. For me, it was a splinter of another world, tucked into the small utility pocket of my trousers. It was a simple, hand-carved cross, fashioned from the olive wood of the Holy Land by my grandmother's patient hands. She had pressed it into my palm before I left, her touch as soft as her prayers. It was my anchor, a tangible connection to a God I had been taught was a fortress, a shield, a very present help in trouble. But in the crucible of Al-Kharid, faith is not a fortress. It is a finite resource, like water or ammunition. Each day, the heat, the fear, the casual brutality of our existence would evaporate a little more of it. Each patrol through a maze of hostile streets. Each glimpse of a child's face hardened by a lifetime of conflict. Each mournful call to prayer from a minaret that seemed to accuse the sky itself. It all chipped away at the certainty I had brought with me. God, the architect of my quiet, green world, felt like an absentee landlord in this sun-scorched slum. The divine felt distant, muffled by the sheer, grinding weight of human misery. This is not a story about the politics of war or the grand strategies of nations. Armies are not moved by ideas, but by frightened young men with rifles in their hands, trying to survive until their next meal, their next letter from home, their next rotation. This is a story about what happens when those men are pushed beyond the limits of their training, their courage, and their belief in a rational universe. It is a story about a single moment in a forgotten firefight, in a squalid alleyway that had no name, where the intricate machinery of modern warfare failed, and all that was left was the oldest, most primal transaction of the human spirit: prayer. In the Al-Kharid Valley, prayer is not a gentle, whispered thing. It is a desperate, guttural cry hurled into a silent sky. It is the last round in the magazine, the final option when tactics and technology have been exhausted. For thousands of years, this land has soaked up the prayers of the desperate, supplications for rain, for victory, for mercy, for a quick death. It is a land saturated with the echoes of faith pushed to its breaking point. The story you are about to read is about one such prayer. It is the story of a moment when I was stripped of everything, my pride, my skill, my hope, and left with nothing but a splinter of olive wood and a scream that existed only in the confines of my own skull. It is about what happened next. Was it a coincidence of meteorology? A freak gust of wind in a valley known for strange thermal currents? Or was it something else? Was it an answer? An act of impossible, terrifying grace in a place that grace had seemingly abandoned? That is the question that has haunted me ever since. It is the question that divided my platoon, that forged a saint from a scared kid, and that set me on a path from which I could never turn back. The events of that day became a fault line, splitting my life into a before and an after. Before you can understand the man I became, the leader, the pariah, the doubter, the believer, you must understand the boy I was in those final seconds of a doomed patrol. A boy who had forgotten the color green, who was running low on faith, and who, with the world exploding around him, finally looked up from the battlefield and gambled his soul on a cry for help. This is the story of that prayer, and the terrible, beautiful, impossible answer it received in the dust. This is the story of Chapter 1. The Dust of Gethsemane. The sun over the Al-Kharid Valley was not a source of life, but a hammer. It beat down on the ochre dust, on the skeletal remains of buildings, on the scorched metal of our Humvee, and on the frayed nerves of every soldier in Bravo Company. For 3 weeks, this valley had been our world, a world reduced to the colors of sand and blood, the sounds of distant gunfire, and the ceaseless, whispering wind that carried the ghosts of forgotten skirmishes. My name is Corporal Elias Vance, and I was beginning to forget the color green. My faith, like the water in our canteens, was a resource I tried to conserve, to ration. It had been strong when I'd left home, a solid, reassuring weight in my chest, much like the small wooden cross my grandmother had pressed into my palm. It was carved from olive wood, worn smooth by her own anxious prayers. Now, in this sun-bleached purgatory, that faith felt thin, diluted by the relentless heat and the ever-present stench of cordite and fear. God felt very far away from Al-Kharid. That morning began like any other. The pre-dawn chill gave way to the oppressive heat with shocking speed. We were on patrol, a routine sweep through a sector designated Coyote's Tooth, a maze of collapsed souks and bullet-pocked houses that offered 1,000 perfect ambush points. Sergeant Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of past deployments, chewed on an unlit cigar, his eyes constantly scanning the rooftops. To my left, PFC Ramirez, a kid barely old enough to buy a beer back home, was humming a pop song, his youthful optimism a fragile shield against the tension that coated everything like the fine dust. Keep your eyes peeled, Vance. Miller's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Place gives me the creeps. Copy that, Sarge. I mumbled, my hand tightening on the grip of my rifle. The metal was already growing warm. The silence H. There was a different kind of noise. It was heavy, expectant. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of waiting. Every shadow could hold a threat, every darkened doorway a muzzle flash. We moved in a practiced rhythm, a dance of survival, covering each other, our boots crunching softly on rubble and shattered glass. I clutched the cross in my pocket. A silent prayer formed in my mind, more a habit than a heartfelt plea. Asterisk, keep us safe. Just get us through today. Asterisk, it felt hollow, a worn-out phrase repeated into an empty sky. What was one more whispered prayer in a land that had soaked up millions of them for thousands of years? That's when the world exploded. It wasn't a single sound, but a symphony of chaos. The deafening crump of an RPG striking the wall a dozen feet ahead of us showered us with stone and dust. The air ripped apart with the distinctive, terrifying crackle of AK-47 fire from multiple positions. It was a well-planned, L-shaped ambush. We were caught in the killing jar. Contact. Rooftops, 10 o'clock. East wall. Miller's voice, stripped of its calm, was a raw shout. Get to cover. Training takes over. You don't think, you react. I dove behind the blasted remnant of a market stall, the splintered wood offering pathetic cover. Ramirez was beside me, his song forgotten, his face a pale mask of shock. Bullets stitched the air around us, a high-pitched, deadly whine. Chips of concrete and dirt sprayed my face. We returned fire, the familiar, concussive bark of our M4s, a desperate answer to their relentless chatter. But they had the high ground, the angles. We were exposed, pinned down like insects on a board. I saw Martinez go down, a silent, crumpling fall. No scream, just gone. The world narrowed to the space behind my rifle's sight, to the frantic search for targets, the recoil against my shoulder. Hope was a currency we had long run out of. Survival was measured in seconds. A machine gun opened up from a second-story window, a heavy, rhythmic thumping that tore through our cover and confidence. It chewed up the stone wall above my head, raining debris down on us. "We're pinned," Ramirez yelled, his voice cracking. "We can't move." Suppressing fire, Miller ordered, his own rifle roaring. But it was like throwing pebbles against a hurricane. They were too well entrenched. The radio crackled with panicked voices, calls for support that felt a world away. We were on our own. Another man cried out, a sharp, terrible sound that was cut short. The air grew thick, hot, and metallic. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. My training, my muscle memory, it was all there, but underneath it, a cold, dark certainty was creeping in. This is it. This is how it ends. In the dust, under a foreign sun, 1,000 miles from everything I loved. A bullet ricocheted off the metal frame of the stall, screaming past my ear. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. I saw my grandmother's face, her gentle smile as she gave me the cross. I saw a Sunday morning in our small town, the scent of rain on asphalt, the sound of church bells. A life so vibrant, so real, and it was about to be extinguished in a storm of lead and fire. Desperation is a powerful thing. It strips you of pride, of logic, of everything but the raw will to live. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled in my pocket and closed around the worn olive wood. It was warm from my body, a small, tangible piece of a world that no longer seemed to exist. My training had given me no more options. My weapon could not save me from this. My sergeant's orders could not conjure a miracle. There was nothing left. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my cheek against the dusty stock of my rifle. The cacophony of the battle faded to a dull roar in the background. In that moment, I wasn't Corporal Vance. I was just Eli, a scared son, a frightened young man who didn't want to die. And I prayed. It wasn't the rote, half-hearted prayer from earlier. This was a cry from the deepest part of my soul, a primal scream sent into the void, hoping for an echo. God. Oh, God, if you are there, if you can hear me in this hell. Please. I'm not ready. Please, God, just get me out. Protect me. Shield us. I want to go home. Just let me go home. Lord, have mercy. The words weren't spoken, but screamed in the confines of my mind. It was a prayer of absolute surrender. I had done all I could. The rest was not in my hands. I clutched the cross so hard my knuckles were white. For a single, eternal second, I waited for the impact, the searing pain that would end it all. And then, something shifted. It wasn't a thunderclap or a choir of angels. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A sudden, powerful gust of wind, unseasonal and strange, swept through the narrow street. It wasn't the gentle breeze from before. This was a force. It lifted the fine, powdery dust of Al-Kharid, the dust of decades of conflict and decay, and churned it into a thick, swirling cloud. It rose like a wall, a sudden, opaque curtain of ochre. For a moment, visibility dropped to near zero. The relentless sun was dimmed to a hazy, orange smear. The machine gunner's nest, our primary threat, vanished behind the swirling screen of earth. The incoming fire, which had been so accurate, so terrifyingly precise, became wild. The bullets still flew, but they were blind now, cracking harmlessly into the walls around us instead of at us. What the hell? Ramirez coughed, his voice filled with disbelief. Miller didn't hesitate. He saw the impossible opportunity, the divine or coincidental reprieve. Now, move now, to that doorway. Go. We scrambled, using the precious seconds of confusion the dust storm had given us. We half-dragged, half-carried our wounded, moving through the choking, swirling gloom. It was surreal. One moment, we were facing certain death. The next, we were shrouded in a protective cloak of the very ground we fought on. We crashed through the doorway of a shattered apothecary, the scent of ancient herbs and spices mingling with the dust and cordite. We were out of the direct line of fire. The dust cloud outside raged for another 30 seconds, an eternity in a firefight, before it began to settle as quickly as it had appeared. As the air cleared, we could see the enemy positions, confused, their advantage gone. The brief, miraculous respite had been enough. It was the opening our reinforcements needed. The sound of approaching heavy vehicles rumbled in the distance, and the enemy, knowing their element of surprise was lost, began to withdraw. The firefight continued for another 10 minutes, but the decisive moment had passed. We had survived the killing jar. As the last of the enemy fire faded, an eerie silence returned to the valley, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the frantic crackle of the radio. I leaned my back against the cool stone wall, my body trembling with adrenaline. My lungs burned from the dust. My hand was still clenched in my pocket. I slowly pulled it out. There, resting in my grimy, sweat-soaked palm, was the small wooden cross. A fine layer of the same dust that had just saved our lives coated its surface, filling the lines of the carving, making it seem ancient, powerful. Ramirez looked at me, his young eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "Did you see that? That wind, it came from nowhere." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I looked from the cross in my hand to the sky above the shattered rooftops, now clear and blue once more. Coincidence? A freak weather phenomenon? My logical mind, the part of me the army had trained, tried to find a rational explanation. But my heart, the part of me that had cried out in the darkness, knew better. In the midst of hell, in the moment of absolute despair, I had prayed. And the very dust of the earth had risen up to shield me. The battle for the Al-Kharid Valley was not over. But for Corporal Elias Vance, the war within had just found its ceasefire. Chapter 2. The Taste of Ash and Grace. The silence that followed the storm of gunfire was a physical thing. It pressed in on us, a heavy blanket woven from shock and the sharp, coppery scent of blood. Inside the apothecary, dust motes danced in the slanted bars of light cutting through the shattered windows, each one a tiny ghost in the suspended air. The world outside had fallen quiet, but inside my head, the phantom crackle of AK-47s and the deafening roar of the RPG still echoed. A bone-deep weariness settled over us, heavier than our body armor. The adrenaline that had turned us into twitching bundles of survival instinct was draining away, leaving behind an empty, trembling hollow. PFC Ramirez was on his knees beside me, head bowed, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He wasn't humming now. Status report. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the haze, raw but steady. It was the anchor in our swirling disorientation. "Sound off now," voices answered, shaky and coated in dust. "Lopez good. Chun here." "I'm good, Sarge." The roll call was a staccato prayer, each name an affirmation of life. But two names were missing. Martinez and Corporal Davies. The silence where their voices should have been was louder than any explosion. Miller moved with a grim economy of motion, his M4 held low as he checked the doorway. His face was a granite mask, his eyes holding the flat, hard look of a man counting his dead. "Chun, you're on the door. Watch that west alley. Vance, Ramirez, with me. We check on the others." We moved back into the street, a place that had been a maelstrom of death only moments before. The air was still thick with the fine ochre dust, which now coated everything in a uniform layer of pale brown, like a world painted in sepia. It clung to our sweat-soaked uniforms, gritted between our teeth, and muted the garish red of the bloodstains on the ground. We found Davies first. He was propped against the wall of the souk, a dark patch spreading across his thigh. His face was pale, his teeth clenched, but he gave Miller a weak thumbs up. "Just my leg, Sarge. It's not great." "You'll live," Miller grunted, his hands already moving to apply a tourniquet with brutal efficiency. The act was professional, almost detached, but I saw the slight tremor in his fingers. Martinez was a few feet away, lying beside the splintered market stall that had served as my pathetic cover. There was no need for a tourniquet. His eyes were open, staring at the unforgiving sky, a small, dark hole in his helmet the only sign of the violence that had stolen him from us. The sight punched the air from my lungs. I had known him for a year. We had talked about baseball, about the girls back home, about the shitty coffee in the mess hall. And now he was just a casualty report, a name on a list. Ramirez made a choked sound and turned away. I stood frozen, my rifle feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. The dust of the earth, the very dust I had moments ago seen as a shield, now seemed like a shroud, gently settling over a fallen friend. "You shield one and take another?" The question rose unbidden in my mind, a bitter, blasphemous thought. The rumbling we'd heard earlier grew into the thunderous approach of the rescue convoy. Bradleys and MRAPs clattered into the narrow street, their heavy machine guns swiveling to cover any remaining threats. Medics swarmed out, a whirlwind of field dressings and morphine. The scene dissolved into the controlled chaos of casualty evacuation. As they loaded Davies onto a stretcher, Ramirez came to my side, his face chalky. He gestured vaguely at the sky, at the street. "Corporal, Vance, that dust," he swallowed hard. "That wasn't natural. You saw it, right? It came from nowhere. Just when you—" He trailed off, looking at the pocket of my trousers where I had put the cross. Before I could answer, Miller was there. He clapped a heavy hand on Ramirez's shoulder, forcing the kid to look at him. "It was a freak wind, Private. A goddamn lucky break. You focus on that. You start seeing ghosts and angels in every gust of wind out here. You'll lose your mind. Understand?" "But Sarge." "Understand." Miller's voice was low, but it held the unyielding force of a rock slide. "Yes, Sergeant," Ramirez mumbled, his gaze falling to the ground. Miller's eyes met mine over the kid's head. There was no mystery in them, only a profound, weary pragmatism. He wasn't denying what happened. He was simply refusing to label it. To him, it wasn't a miracle or a coincidence. It was a tactical variable, an unexpected event that had changed the outcome. He dealt in what was, not in why. He dealt in getting his living soldiers home and his dead soldiers honored. The metaphysics could wait. The journey back to the forward operating base was a blur. I sat in the back of an MRAP, the vehicle swaying a lulling, nauseating rhythm. The bodies of our dead, zipped into black bags, lay strapped to the floor. The smell of antiseptic from Davies's field dressing couldn't mask the smell of death. I stared out of the thick, bulletproof glass at the passing landscape. The same skeletal buildings, the same scorched earth. But it looked different now. I kept searching the horizon, half expecting the air to shimmer, for the sky to part. It didn't. The sun was just the sun, a hammer beating down on the land. Back at the FOB, the routine was a comfort. We cleaned our weapons, a sacred, methodical ritual. The familiar scent of gun oil, the satisfying click of the bolt carrier group sliding home, the meticulous process of wiping away every grain of sand and dust. It was a way of reimposing order on a world that had just shown us nothing but chaos. I worked in silence, my mind a battlefield of its own. A freak wind, Miller's words. It was the logical explanation. The valley was a known corridor for strange thermal currents. A sudden shift in pressure could easily create a localized dust devil. It was science. It was meteorology. It was random. But the timing, my own thoughts, a stubborn counterargument. The exact moment. The perfect screen. The way it rose like a wall, not swirled like a vortex. It had felt intentional, purposeful. Later, after the debriefing, after enduring the sympathetic but hollow pats on the back from men who hadn't been there, I found myself alone behind the barracks, near the wire fence that separated our small island of order from the vast, hostile wilderness. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised colors of purple and orange. I pulled the olive wood cross from my pocket. It felt warm, alive in my hand. The fine alcarid dust was pressed deep into the grain of the wood, filling the carved lines of Christ's body, making the ancient symbol one with the earth of this place. I tried to rub it clean with my thumb, but the dust was stubborn, ingrained. It was part of the cross now. Was this faith? This terrifying, uncertain thing? It wasn't the gentle, reassuring faith of my grandmother's church. That was a faith of hymns and stained glass, of potluck dinners and familiar prayers. This was a faith forged in the crucible of terror, born from a scream into the void. It didn't feel like a comforting hand on my shoulder. It felt like a branding iron. I thought of Martinez, his lifeless eyes reflecting the empty sky. The miracle, the maybe miracle, had not saved him. Grace had fallen on us, but it was a selective, terrible grace. It tasted of ash. It left you with unanswerable questions that gnawed at the soul. Why me and not him? Is God a tactician, sacrificing a pawn to save a corporal? The thought was vile, and I pushed it away. Tough one today. I turned. It was Sergeant Miller, an unlit cigarillo in his hand. He wasn't looking at me, but out at the darkening valley. Yes, Sarge. My voice was rough. He was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching between us. Ramirez thinks God saved us, he said finally, his tone flat, observational. He's a kid, I said, not knowing what else to say. We were all kids once, Miller replied, a flicker of something, sadness, memory, in his eyes. He finally looked at me, his gaze falling to the cross in my hand. You believe that's what happened, Vance? It was the most important question I had ever been asked. My training, my logic, my fear of being seen as weak or irrational screamed no. But the memory of that absolute, soul-crushing terror and the impossible deliverance that followed whispered yes. I looked down at the cross, at the dust of Gethsemane embedded within it. I couldn't give him the answer he probably wanted, the pragmatic, soldierly answer. And I couldn't give him the answer Ramirez would have given, full of wide-eyed certainty. I believe, I said slowly, choosing my words as carefully as I would choose my footing on a minefield, that I was out of options. And then, I wasn't. Miller held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a short, sharp nod, as if that was enough. He seemed to understand that the space between those two truths was where I now had to live. Get some rest, Corporal, he said, turning to walk away. Tomorrow's another day. I watched him go, a man who had made his peace with a world that offered no easy answers. I remained by the fence, clutching the cross. The wind picked up, a cool evening breeze that carried none of the day's violence. It whispered through the concertina wire, a low, mournful sound. I didn't have peace. I didn't have certainty. My faith wasn't a solid shield. It was a fractured thing, a mosaic of doubt and desperate hope, held together by the memory of a prayer and the impossible grace of a storm of dust. And for now, in the relentless heart of the Alcarid Valley, it would have to be enough. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Dust. Sleep, when it finally came, was no refuge. It was a descent back into the narrow street, a place where the laws of physics had frayed at the edges. I was there again, behind the splintered wood of the market stall, the world a cacophony of incoming fire. But in the dream, the dust did not rise like a wall. It seeped from the ground like a toxic fog, thick and choking. It filled my mouth and lungs not with grit, but with the fine, silted taste of the grave. It swirled around Martinez, not hiding him, but caressing him, pulling him down into the earth. I tried to scream his name, but my throat was packed with mud. I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sheets of my cot twisted around me, and soaked in a cold sweat. The low hum of the FOB's generators was the only sound, a constant, mechanical reassurance that I was here, and not there. The next day, the sun rose with an indifferent glare. The world had not been altered, but our small corner of it had. The shift was subtle, a change in atmospheric pressure that you felt in your bones before you could name it. It was in the way men looked at me in the chow line. Before, I was just Corporal Vance. Now, their eyes lingered a moment too long, a mixture of curiosity, awe, and in some cases, a faint, skeptical pity. The story, carried on the back of Ramirez's breathless testimony, had already spread through the company like a virus. Asterisk the dust devil of Al-Suk. Vance's miracle, asterisk. In the mess hall, the clatter of metal trays and the low murmur of conversations felt different. I sat with Chun and Lopez, trying to pretend it was just another morning. Lopez, a wiry specialist from San Antonio with a tongue as sharp as concertina wire, poked at his powdered eggs. So, he began, not looking at me. I hear you've been promoted. To prophet. Knock it off, Lopez, Chun said quietly, his gaze fixed on his tray. What? I'm just saying. Kid Ramirez is telling everyone you called down a sandstorm with a prayer. Next thing you know, he'll be asking you to turn his canteen water into Rip It. It was a freak weather event, I said, my voice flat, repeating Miller's catechism. The valley is famous for them. Yeah, freakishly convenient. Lopez shot back, finally meeting my eyes. His were dark and hard. He'd been in country longer than any of us. Look, I'm glad we're not scraping you and the kid off the pavement. But don't go thinking some man in the sky is picking favorites. It's bad for morale. He jabbed his fork towards the empty seat at our table. Martinez's seat. The point was made, sharp and cruel. Before I could answer, Ramirez sat down, his tray rattling. His face was alight with a strange, feverish energy. He looked like a man who had seen the face of God and was still blinded by the glare. Corporal, he said, his voice a reverent whisper. I was reading this morning. In Exodus, when Moses is leading the people out of Egypt, God goes before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way. He looked at me, his eyes wide and shining. A pillar of cloud, Corporal. Pillar of dust. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The air at the table grew thick and heavy. Lopez let out a short, derisive snort and stood up, scraping his chair back. I gotta go clean my rifle. Keep it free of divine intervention. He walked away without a backward glance. He doesn't understand, Ramirez said, his gaze following Lopez with a sad shake of his head. He wasn't there. He didn't feel it. He turned back to me. But you did, didn't you? When you held the cross. You felt it. I didn't know what I had felt, other than pure, animal terror. I looked at the boy's expectant face, his desperate need for this to be simple, to be a sign of a benevolent power in a world that offered constant evidence to the contrary. To tell him the truth, that I felt nothing but a primal scream for survival, that the grace I'd been given felt arbitrary and stained with my friend's blood, would be like kicking a crutch out from under a wounded man. I was just trying to stay alive, Ramirez, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Same as you. His face fell, just for a second, a flicker of disappointment. But the certainty returned almost at once. No, he insisted. It was more than that. I know it was. Later that afternoon, we held the memorial. We stood in formation under the brutal sun, our shadows stark and short on the packed gravel of the parade ground. An empty pair of boots, an upturned rifle with a helmet resting on the stock, and a set of dog tags dangling from the pistol grip, the stark, universally understood altar of the fallen soldier. The chaplain, a captain with a kind face and tired eyes, spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of a hero welcomed into God's eternal kingdom. His words were smooth, polished by repetition, designed to be a balm on a raw wound. They slid off me like water off armor. He spoke of a God of order and purpose, of a plan that we, in our finite understanding, could not grasp. It felt like a lie. Or if it was the truth, the plan was monstrous. My God, my maybe God, wasn't one of comforting plans. It was a chaotic, terrifying force that intervened with the violence of an explosion, leaving shrapnel of unanswerable questions in its wake. I looked at the men around me. Ramirez stood ramrod straight, tears tracking clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. He was mourning his friend, but his grief was buttressed by his newfound faith. He believed Martinez was in a better place, a martyr whose death was sanctified by the miracle that saved the rest of us. Chen's face was a stoic mask, his sorrow buried deep. And Miller stood like a statue carved from rock, his eyes fixed on the memorial, his jaw set. He was not looking for comfort from the sky. His faith was in the men standing beside him, and his grief was a private, heavy thing he would carry alone. When the ceremony was over and we were dismissed, Miller caught my arm. His grip was like iron. A word, corporal. He led me away from the dispersing formation, towards the deafening roar of the generator sheds, a place where conversation was impossible to overhear. He stopped and turned to me, his eyes sweeping over my face, searching for something. Ramirez is making you into a saint, he stated, not as a question. The men are talking. Some are spooked, some are laughing, some are starting to believe him. It's a fault line, Vance. And it's running right through my platoon. I needed to stop. What do you want me to do, Sergeant? I asked, my voice rising to be heard over the generators. He sees what he wants to see. I want you to be a corporal in the United States Army, not some desert mystic. Whatever happened out there, a gust of wind, an act of God, I don't give a damn what you call it in your own head. It's over. It was a tactical event. It's in the AAR. End of story. We have a job to do. We have patrols to run. I can't have a man second-guessing if the wind is on his side, or another man thinking he's bulletproof because he's standing next to you. It gets people killed. Do you understand me? I didn't ask for this, I said, the frustration and exhaustion of the last 24 hours boiling over. I was just trying not to die. None of us asked for it. Miller's voice softened, the anger replaced by a familiar weariness. We don't ask for the bullet with our name on it, and we don't ask for the one that misses. We just deal with what is. Right now, what is a platoon that's getting distracted by ghost stories. You are the only one who can shut it down. Talk to Ramirez. Be a corporal. Set him straight. He didn't wait for an answer. He just gave me a hard, final look and walked away, leaving me in the thunderous noise of the generators, the hot air thick with the smell of diesel exhaust. I knew he was right. I had to talk to Ramirez. I had to douse the fire before it spread. But how could I take away the one thing that was giving that kid comfort in the face of all this? How could I tell him the pillar of cloud was just dust, meaningless and random, when a part of me, a terrified, desperate part, wasn't sure of that at all? I found the cross in my pocket, its surface now smooth from my constant, unconscious touch. The dust of Al-Kharid was still wedged deep in the grain, a permanent part of its composition. I had become like the cross, I realized. The dust of that moment, the questions and the fear and the terrible, inexplicable grace, was now embedded in me. It couldn't be wiped away. I was no longer just Corporal Vance. I was the man who had been there, the man who had prayed. I was a living echo of the impossible, and the sound was beginning to tear my world apart. Chapter 4, A Heavy Grace. The generators were a constant beast, their roar the heartbeat of the FOB. To me, they sounded like a judgment, a ceaseless reminder of Sergeant Miller's order. Asterisk, be a corporal. Set him straight. Asterisk, the words had been rattling around in my skull for hours, wearing grooves of anxiety into the soft tissue of my brain. I knew where I would find him. There was only one place a man like Ramirez would go to wrestle with God, or to thank him. The chapel wasn't a building, but a GP medium tent staked down near the perimeter fence, its canvas skin bleached pale by the sun. Inside, the air was thick and still, smelling of dust and the faint, sweet scent of old paper from the box of donated Bibles. Light filtered through the canvas in a hazy, jaundiced glow, illuminating rows of folding metal chairs aimed at a simple wooden crate that served as an altar. Ramirez was there, sitting in the front row. He wasn't praying. He had a small, government-issue notepad and a pen, and he was writing with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. I walked down the makeshift aisle, my boots scuffing softly on the plywood floor. The sound was swallowed by the tense, heavy silence. He looked up as my shadow fell over him, and his face broke into that same brilliant, unwavering smile. It was like looking into the sun. "Corporal," he said, his voice hushed with reverence, as if we were in a grand cathedral and not a tent in the Iraqi desert. I was just writing it all down. What happened? So I wouldn't forget any of it. Forget? I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. I don't think anyone who was there is going to forget. He nodded, undeterred by my tone. No, sir. But the details. The way the air felt just before. The sound it made. It's important. It's testimony. There it was. The language of faith, a world away from the Army's sterile lexicon of ARs and tactical events. I pulled a chair around and sat opposite him, our knees almost touching. I had to break this spell. For him, for the platoon, for Miller. Look, Ramirez. I began, trying to channel Miller's blunt pragmatism. We need to talk about what you're telling people. The truth, he offered, his eyes wide and clear. Your version of it, I corrected. This miracle narrative, calling me a prophet, quoting Exodus. It's got to stop. A flicker of hurt crossed his face. Why? It's what happened. You prayed, and God answered. He sent a pillar of dust to shield us. He sent a localized, high-velocity wind event common to this valley's topography. I recited, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It kicked up a lot of dust. We got lucky. Martinez didn't. That's it. That's the whole story. No, he said, his voice soft but firm, shaking his head slowly. That's not the story. That's just the facts. The story is the why. You held up that cross. He gestured to my cargo pocket, where the wooden shape was a faint but constant pressure against my leg. I saw your face. You weren't just hoping for a gust of wind, Corporal. You were calling on him. And he came. A hot, useless anger coiled in my gut. He was making it impossible. He was turning my most desperate, terrified moment into a holy relic. I was scared, kid. I was doing anything I could think of to not get my head blown off. It wasn't a summons, it was a scream. There's a difference. Is there? He asked, his gaze so earnest it was infuriating. The Bible is full of people screaming at God. He still listens. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I know you feel it too, don't you? This change. This grace. You can't tell me you don't feel it. I felt something. I felt the weight of Martinez's death. I felt the suspicious stares in the chow hall. I felt Miller's disappointment and the platoon's unease. If this was grace, it was heavier than any sin. It was a crushing, suffocating grace that was pinning me to the ground. What I feel, I said, my voice low and tight, is that we have a job to do. And I can't have the men in this platoon thinking I'm some kind of holy man who can call up sandstorms. They need to trust their training, their gear, and the man next to them. Not a weather forecast from God. It's dangerous. It's more dangerous to deny his power. Ramirez shot back, his fervor rising. He showed us he's with us. With you. That's not a danger, Corporal, it's a shield. It's a weapon. The word hung in the air between us. Weapon. He saw what happened as a tool to be used, a divine force to be called upon. The fault line Miller had spoken of wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a chasm opening right at my feet, and Ramirez was on the other side, beckoning me across. I thought of telling him the unvarnished truth, that in that moment, I felt nothing but the vibration of the rounds hitting the wall, that the cross was just a piece of wood, that my prayer was just a string of panicked words flung into an empty sky. I saw the words forming, saw the blow they would land, and I couldn't do it. It would have been an act of cruelty, a violation of this sacred, dusty space. I stood up, scraping the chair back. The conversation was a failure. I hadn't set him straight. I had only cemented his conviction. Just keep it to yourself, Ramirez, I said, the words feeling weak and inadequate. Keep it in here. I gestured vaguely at the tent around us. For morale. He looked up at me, a deep sadness in his eyes, the kind of pity a true believer reserves for a man who refuses to see the light that is blinding him. I'll try, Corporal, he said. But we both knew he wouldn't. You can't keep a light like that under a bushel. You can't contain a fire. 2 days later, the fire spread. We were gathered in the briefing tent for a route clearance patrol, the kind of mundane, nerve-shredding mission that was our daily bread. The air was stale with the smell of sweat and ripid energy drinks. Sergeant Miller stood in front of a satellite map of the sector, a red line marking our intended path. He was all business, his voice a low, steady rumble as he went over IED indicators, potential ambush points, and rules of engagement. We'll be moving through the Al-Kharad Market District. Here, he said, tapping a point on the map. It was 2 clicks east of where we'd been hit. A collective tension tightened the room. Intel says it's clear, but Intel's been wrong before. Heads on a swivel. No complacency. He went through assignments. Chin on the saw. Lopez on point. Me on rear security. Then he paused, his gaze sweeping over us. Questions. The silence was thick. No one wanted to go back there, but no one would say it. Then, Ramirez's voice, clear and confident, cut through the quiet. We'll be safe, Sergeant. Every head turned towards him. Miller's eyes narrowed to slits. Is that a question, Private? No, Sergeant, Ramirez said, his face shining with that terrible, innocent certainty. He wasn't being insubordinate. He was making a statement of fact, as if relaying a weather report. He looked directly at me. We've got Corporal Vance with us. God's got our 6. The air went out of the room. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes land on me, a physical weight. I saw Lopez roll his eyes, a disgusted smirk on his face. I saw Chen's jaw tighten. And I saw Miller's face, which had gone from stern to something cold and dangerous. The fault line had just cracked wide open, right in the middle of his mission brief. He took a slow step towards Ramirez, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. He stopped directly in front of the private, forcing him to crane his neck to look up. Private Ramirez, Miller said, his voice dangerously soft. The only thing that has your 6 is Corporal Vance and his M4. The only thing keeping you safe is your armor, your training, and your discipline. God is not a member of this platoon. He is not on my chain of command. His divine intervention is not part of our tactical planning. Am I making myself absolutely, crystal clear? Sergeant, I just meant. Asterisk, am I clear? Asterisk, Miller's voice was a whip crack. Yes, Sergeant, Ramirez whispered, his face finally losing its beatific glow, replaced by a flush of shame. Miller didn't move. He held Ramirez in his gaze for a few more seconds before turning his attention, like the barrel of a heavy weapon, onto me. The entire room watched. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face said it all. Asterisk, I gave you an order. You failed. Asterisk. He turned back to the map. Briefing's over. Wheels up in 30. The men filed out, a low murmur rippling through them. They shuffled past me, some pointedly avoiding my eyes, others giving me a strange, searching look. I felt like a freak, an unstable element. Lopez brushed past my shoulder, muttering just loud enough for me to hear. Nice work, Prophet. Getting us all killed. I stood there, rooted to the spot, long after everyone else had gone. Miller was still at the front of the tent, methodically folding his map. He did it with precise, angry movements. He still hadn't looked at me again. The burden of dust had become the burden of command, of morale, of the lives of these men. My prayer in the alley, that desperate, animal scream into the void, hadn't just brought the dust. It had brought this. A heavy, unholy grace that was proving to be more of a curse than a blessing. And we were about to walk right back into the place where it all began. Chapter 5, The Slow March. The ritual was the only church I had left. The familiar catechism of preparation. The click of a ceramic plate sliding into its carrier, a heavy promise against the chest. The practice slide and clack of a bolt carrier group being checked. The scent of CLP gun oil, acrid and metallic, a kind of incense for the god of war. In the staging area, a cavernous tent buzzing with the low hum of fluorescent lights. Men moved with a grim economy of motion, the air thick with unspoken anxieties. They gave me a wide berth. It wasn't overt, not an organized shunning, but a subtle shifting of space, a gravitational field of unease with me at its center. Men who would normally trade insults or share a last-minute swig of water now found their gear on the other side of the room intensely fascinating. Lopez slammed his locker with unnecessary force, his glare a physical blow I felt across the concrete floor. Chun, methodical and quiet, simply met my eyes for a long second, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his saw. It was worse than anger. It was assessment. I was a variable they couldn't account for, a problem in their combat equation. And then there was Ramirez. He kicked up with a placid calm that was profoundly unnerving. His movements were smooth, unhurried, as if he were dressing for a Sunday service. When he caught my eye, that brilliant, beatific smile bloomed on his face, an offering I refused to accept. He saw the briefing not as a reprimand, but as a test of his faith, and Miller's anger as the trial of a lesser man who couldn't comprehend the divine. He believed in me. I could feel the pressure of his conviction from 20 feet away, a heat against my skin. Vance. Miller's voice cut through my thoughts. He stood by the door, already fully kit, his helmet cradled in his arm. He wasn't looking at me, but at the HESCO barriers outside. Rear of the second chalk. You're with me. It wasn't a request. It was a leash. He was putting me where he could see me, where he could contain the damage. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Hoa, Sergeant. The ride out in the MRAP was a descent into a hot, vibrating hell. The roar of the diesel engine was a physical presence, pressing in on us, making conversation impossible. It was a blessing. I sat wedged between the hull and a stack of ammo cans, the steel sweating in the heat. Through the narrow, thick-paned ballistic glass, the world was a strip of overexposed desert, bleached of color, shaking violently with every rut in the road. Across from me, Ramirez sat with his rifle held loosely in his lap. He wasn't staring out the window or lost in the anxious energy that filled the cramped compartment. He was watching me. His gaze was steady, full of a terrible, misplaced adoration. He was waiting for a sign, a word, a look that would reaffirm the fragile, dangerous covenant he'd built between us. I stared at the back of the driver's head, focusing on the sweat stains spreading across his collar, willing Ramirez's stare to burn itself out. The wooden cross in my cargo pocket felt like a block of hot lead against my thigh. When the hydraulics hissed and the heavy ramp thumped down onto the dusty pavement, the change in atmosphere was instant. The engine's roar was replaced by the alien sounds of the Al-Kharid market. The distant bleating of a goat, the unintelligible cadence of a vendor's cry, the thin, reedy music from a hidden radio. The smells hit us next, human and roasting meat, open sewage, and the cloying sweetness of cheap tobacco, all layered over the permanent grid of dust. We were ghosts in green armor, specters of a foreign power moving through a world that paused, held its breath, and waited for us to pass. Miller set a slow, deliberate pace. This was the heads on a swivel part of the brief made manifest. My eyes scanned rooftops, windows, alley mouths, the faces of the men who stopped to watch us. Every parked car was a potential VBIED. Every pile of trash a potential hiding spot for a pressure plate. The sun beat down on my helmet, cooking my brain. Sweat trickled into my eyes, stinging, blurring my vision. This was the metronome of dread, the slow march through enemy territory where nothing happened, over and over, until suddenly, violently, it did. And I knew where we were going. Every step brought us closer. I could feel the pull of it, a dark magnetism. The place where the world had torn open. We rounded a corner, past a butcher shop where fly-blown carcasses of lamb hung on hooks, and there it was. It looked smaller, more ordinary than it did in my memory. Just a gap between two crumbling, three-story buildings. A missing tooth in the city's grin. The wall on the far side was a scarred canvas of our last engagement. A constellation of pockmarks from the 7.62 rounds that had pinned us down. Near the bottom, where Martinez had fallen, a Jackson Pollock spatter of rust brown stained the concrete, obscene in its permanence. The air itself seemed different here, heavier, as if the echoes of the gunfire had been absorbed into the very stones. The platoon slowed, an unconscious hesitation. This was hallowed ground, or cursed ground, or both. Miller didn't break stride. His voice was low, controlled, meant only for us. Eyes up. Keep it moving. But Ramirez had stopped. He stood at the mouth of the alley, his head tilted, his rifle held slack at his side. He wasn't looking at the bullet holes or the stain. He was looking at the air, at the space, as if he could see the spectral form of the dust pillar that had saved them. A look of profound reverence was on his face. It happened right here, he breathed, his voice filled with awe. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand reaching out, as if to touch a sacred relic. Ramirez. Miller's voice was sharp now, a blade of ice in the heat. I gave an order. Ramirez didn't seem to hear him. He was in another world, another time. He stood right here. He whispered, his eyes finding me. The corporal. And he prayed. And the Lord answered with a whirlwind. He turned back to the wall, his fingers now just inches from the bloodstain. This place. I saw it then. The future. Ramirez would make this a shrine. He would bring others. He would tell the story to new replacements, building the legend. My moment of terror would become a piece of platoon lore, a superstition that would get men killed. They would rely on me, on a prayer, instead of on their training. Miller's cold fury, Lopez's contempt, the platoon's fracture, it would all grow from this spot, watered by Ramirez's faith. The fault line would shatter us. Something inside me snapped. The sergeant's order, the fear, the crushing weight of their expectations, it all coalesced into a single, brutal point of clarity. I was a corporal. Miller had given me a mission, and I had failed. This was my last chance to fix it. I broke formation, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. I grabbed Ramirez's shoulder, my fingers digging into the flesh beneath his armor. He flinched, his trance broken, his eyes wide with surprise. Look at it, I said, my voice a low, gravelly rasp I barely recognized. I pushed him forward, forcing him to face the scarred wall, to see the dark stain. Corporal, he stammered. It's not a shrine, Ramirez. I bit out, the words tasting like poison. I gave him a rough shake. It's just a wall. A wall where a man died, because we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all. There was no pillar of fire. There was no whirlwind. There was dust and bullets, and a good man bled out on the ground right there. Do you understand me? His face crumpled. The beatific certainty vanished, replaced by a raw, profound hurt. It was like striking a child. But I saw it. You saw a scared kid holding a piece of wood, hoping he wouldn't die. I snarled, leaning in so only he could hear. You saw luck, and luck runs out. Now you get your head out of the clouds and back on your sector before you get another one of us killed. We are not a church. We are a rifle platoon. Act like it. I shoved him away from me, a final, violent severing. He stumbled back, catching himself before he fell. He looked at me, his eyes swimming with betrayal and confusion. The light was gone. I had snuffed it out. Behind me, the platoon was frozen, watching. I could feel Miller's gaze on my back. I didn't turn to look. I straightened up, slung my rifle, and stared hard at a second-story window across the street, making my world small again. Back to the basics. Scan your sector. Be a corporal. After a long, silent moment, I heard Miller's voice, back to its normal, steady rumble. Push on. The shuffling of boots on pavement resumed. Ramirez fell into step, his head down, his shoulders slumped. The weapon he had tried to make of me was broken. The shield he had believed in was just a man. As we moved away from the alley, leaving its ghosts behind, I felt a strange and terrible lightness. The crushing weight of grace had been lifted, but in its place was something colder and heavier. There was no miracle here. There was only the heat, the weight of my armor, and the long, slow march home. Chapter 6. The Weight of the Word. The march back was a funeral procession. The slow, rhythmic crunch of our boots on gravel was the only percussion in a world that had gone silent. The vibrant, chaotic sounds of the Al-Kharad market seemed to shrink away from us, the vendors' calls dying in their throats as our grim little parade passed. We were no longer just foreign soldiers. We were carriers of a fresh, sour contagion. A schism. I kept my eyes forward, my M4 held at a low ready, forcing my focus onto the crumbling facades of the buildings, the suspicious flicker of a curtain in a high window, the dark maw of another alley. It was the catechism of the infantryman, the litany of survival. Scan your sector. Watch your spacing. But the real threat was no longer in front of me. It was behind me, beside me, radiating from the men I was sworn to lead. The silence that followed my confrontation with Ramirez was not the comfortable quiet of professionals at work. It was a dense, pressurized thing, a vacuum where Ramirez's faith used to be. I could feel it sucking the air from my lungs. Lopez walked with a new swagger, his shoulders back, a smug ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Chen's face was, as always, a mask of stoic calm, but his steps were heavier, more deliberate, as if the ground itself had become less certain. And Ramirez was a ghost. He walked a few paces behind me and to my right, in his designated spot in the formation. But he wasn't there. His head was bowed, his rifle held loosely, pointing at the ground. His gaze was fixed on the scuffed toes of his boots. He moved with the jerky, uncoordinated motions of a marionette whose strings had been cut. I had not just broken his faith in a miracle. I had broken his faith in the world, in the ordering of things. I had taken a man who saw God's hand in a gust of wind and shown him only the indifferent chaos of the universe. It was a cruelty I would carry long after the heat and the dust were a distant memory. The rumbling growl of the MRAPs waiting for us at the extraction point was a relief. It was a promise of an end, at least to this patrol. As the ramp lowered with a familiar hydraulic sigh, we filed in, the silence following us into the cramped, oven-like compartment. I took the same spot as before, wedged against the hull. This time, no one sat directly across from me. A space was left empty, an invisible cordon sanitaire. Ramirez sat further down, his back to me, his helmeted head resting against the vibrating steel wall. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. The ride back was a torment of a different kind. The roar of the engine no longer masked the tension. It amplified it, trapping us in a resonating chamber of unspoken resentments and broken certainties. I caught Lopez's eye. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of vindication that felt more like an accusation. See, it said, I told you he was bullshit. Back at the FOB, the platoon dispersed with an efficiency that bordered on frantic. Men shed their armor like a hated second skin, the clatter of ceramic plates, and the ripping of Velcro filling the staging tent. The normal post-patrol banter, the tired jokes and complaints about the heat, was absent. It was a room full of individuals, not a unit. I watched Ramirez. He moved with a listless torpor, stripping his gear and placing each item into his locker with a kind of blank precision. There was no life in his eyes. He was a shell. I had done what I thought was necessary for the platoon, to cauterize a wound before it became septic. But looking at him now, I saw that I hadn't used a surgeon's scalpel. I had used a rusty knife and a hammer. Vance. My office. Now. Miller's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He was already standing by the makeshift partition of Hesco barriers and plywood that served as his command post. He didn't wait for my acknowledgement, just turned and disappeared behind the drab canvas flap that served as a door. I slid my plate carrier into my locker and followed, my heart a heavy, dull drum against my ribs. This was it. The reckoning. Miller's office was a small kingdom of plywood and paperwork. A folding table was covered in maps held down by ammo cans. A Toughbook laptop glowed in the corner, and the air smelled of stale coffee and dust. He was sitting on a folding chair, his helmet on the table in front of him. He gestured to another chair, a silent command. I sat. He didn't speak for a long time. He picked up a pen and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, his gaze fixed on some point on the map. The only sound was the distant hum of a generator. "Tell me what you think you accomplished out there today, Corporal," he said finally, his voice dangerously soft. He still wasn't looking at me. "I neutralized a threat to unit cohesion, Sergeant," I said, my voice coming out hoarser than I intended. He gave a short, humorless puff of air that might have been a laugh. "You neutralized a threat." He finally looked at me, his eyes like chips of granite. What was the threat? A private who thought God was on our side. A private who was turning a combat zone into a shrine. I countered, my own anger starting to smolder. A private who was building a legend around me that was going to get someone killed. He was teaching people to rely on a prayer instead of their training. On me, instead of themselves. That's the threat. So you corrected him. Yes, Sergeant. You humiliated him in front of the entire platoon. You took his faith, what was probably the only thing keeping him from cracking up in this shithole, and you ground it into the dirt under your boot. That was your correction. I clenched my fists under the table. There was no other way. It was growing. Others were starting to listen. It had to be cut out. All of it. At the root. Miller leaned forward, placing the pen down with meticulous care. You took a problem, Corporal, and you solved it. I'll give you that. The miracle of Al-Kharid is officially dead. No one's going to be looking to you for any more divine fucking intervention. He paused, his gaze boring into me. But you used a hammer to fix a watch. The watch ain't ticking no more, but you got pieces all over the floor. Ramirez, I started. Private Ramirez is broken. Miller cut me off, his voice sharp. He was a good soldier. Motivated. Eager. A little naive, sure, but he shot straight, and he followed orders. The soldier who came back on that truck today? That's a different man. That's a hollow man. And a hollow man in a firefight is a goddamn liability. He's a passenger. A ghost with a rifle. The weight of his words settled in my gut, cold and heavy. He was right. I hadn't just snuffed out the dangerous light in Ramirez's eyes. I had extinguished all of it. You solved one problem, Vance, Miller continued, his voice dropping again. And you created a new one. A bigger one. The platoon is fractured. Half of them think you're an asshole who just brutalized a kid for no reason. The other half, Lopez's buddies, think you're a fraud who finally got called out. Nobody trusts you. And now, I have a soldier who might as well be a sandbag with a pulse. A sandbag I have to take back outside the wire. He stood up and walked over to the canvas flap, looking out at the tent. This isn't on me. This is on you. You broke it. You own it. What's the order, Sergeant? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He turned back, his face a grim mask. Ramirez is your responsibility now. You're his fire team leader. From now on, you don't go anywhere without him. You eat with him, you pull guard with him, you patrol with him. You will personally check his gear, his weapon, his mental state, before every single mission. You will make him a soldier again. I don't care how. You can't give him his faith back, but you damn well better find something to put in its place, or his blood is on your hands. Is that clear? Hoa, Sergeant. The word was ash in my mouth. Dismissed. I walked out of his office and back into the alien landscape of my own platoon. I had traded the impossible weight of sainthood for the simple, grinding weight of a pariah. And now, I had been given a penance. A broken man to carry. I saw Ramirez sitting on his cot, staring at the concrete floor. I walked over and stood before him. He didn't look up. Ramirez, I said. He flinched at the sound of my voice, but didn't move. We're on guard duty tonight. 0200, Tower 4. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I stood there for a moment longer, 1,000 useless apologies dying on my tongue. There was nothing to say. Words were what had caused this. I walked back to my own corner of the tent and sat down on my cot, the springs groaning in protest. I reached into my cargo pocket and pulled out the small wooden cross. It felt different in my hand now. It wasn't a talisman or a burden. It wasn't a connection to a higher power or a symbol of a lie. It was just wood. 2 pieces of wood lashed together with a piece of string. An artifact from a day when a boy's terror and a freak gust of wind had been mistaken for a miracle. A reminder of the choice I had made in that alley. The cost of it was sitting 20 feet away, a hollowed-out kid staring at nothing. And the weight of it was mine to bear alone. Chapter 7. The Vigil. The hours between dismissal and duty crawled by on broken limbs. The platoon tent, normally a hive of low-grade, masculine energy, the cleaning of weapons, the writing of letters, the trading of lies, was a sepulchral chamber. Every cough, every metallic click of a magazine being seated, echoed in the oppressive quiet. Men moved around Ramirez and me as if we were the poles of a failing magnet, repelling everything. They gave us a wide berth, their eyes sliding away, refusing to meet mine. I was no longer Corporal Vance, their squad leader. I was a contamination, a bad omen. When the glowing red numbers on my watch finally clicked over to 0145, the relief was a physical thing. It was a reprieve, an escape. I swung my legs off my cot and began the ritual of gearing up, my movements slow and deliberate in the dim light. Helmet, plate carrier, the familiar weight settling onto my shoulders. Rifle. Each piece was a layer of armor, not just against bullets, but against the silent judgment of my own men. Ramirez was already kidded out, sitting on the edge of his cot, a perfect statue of a soldier waiting for orders. His posture was textbook correct, his hands resting on his knees, his M4 propped beside him. But his eyes were fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, seeing nothing. He looked like a recruiting poster from which the soul had been meticulously photoshopped. Time to go, I said, my voice a low rasp. He stood without a word, shouldered his rifle, and fell in behind me. We walked out of the tent and into the strange, artificial twilight of the FOB. The night air was cooler, but it carried no relief. It was thick with the smells of diesel fumes, churning sewage, and the ever-present, talcum-fine dust. High-powered floodlights bleached the world of color, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like wraiths at the edges of our vision. The only sound was the monolithic hum of the generators, the heartbeat of this island of steel and sand. Our boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the perimeter. Tower 4 was one of the older positions, a rickety-looking construct of steel and sandbags that overlooked a stretch of fallow fields and a crumbling wall that marked the edge of a nearby village. It felt exposed, a lonely tooth jutting out into the blackness. We climbed the ladder in silence. The soldier we were relieving, a cherry-faced kid from another platoon named Galloway, offered a tired grunt of greeting. He gave Ramirez a quick, nervous glance, then focused on me. All quiet, Corporal. Saw some dogs fighting over trash about an hour ago. That's it. Roger that. Get some rack time. He nodded, eager to be gone, and scrambled down the ladder, leaving the three of us in the cramped space. The third man on our shift, Chun, gave me his usual stoic nod. He was already settled behind the M240 machine gun, his eyes scanning the darkness through the thermal sight. If the platoon's schism bothered him, he gave no sign. Chun was a constant, a rock. Tonight, I was grateful for it. I took the post on the left, Ramirez on the right. The tower was just big enough for 3 men to exist in, but tonight it felt as small as a coffin. I settled in, resting my rifle on the sandbag ledge, and began my own scan, first with the naked eye, then through the green-tinted world of my night vision goggles. The fields were a ghostly landscape of shifting shades, the distant village a collection of cold, dark squares. It was a familiar, hypnotic routine. Scan. Breathe. Scan. But my focus wasn't on the kill zone. It was on the man standing 5 feet away. He hadn't moved. He stood ramrod straight, his rifle held at the low ready, pointing out into the darkness. He was a perfect sentry, except his head wasn't moving. He wasn't scanning his sector. He was just staring. A scarecrow in body armor. Miller's words echoed in my head. Asterisk, a hollow man. A sandbag with a pulse. You will make him a soldier again. Asterisk. Ramirez, I said, my voice low but sharp. Scan your sector. He startled, a small, violent flinch. For a second, I thought he might not obey. Then, his head began to move, a slow, mechanical sweep from left to right, then back again. It was the movement of an automaton, devoid of intent. He wasn't looking for threats. He was complying with a command. The distinction was terrifying. An hour passed, then another. The only sounds were the crackle of the radio, Chin occasionally shifting his weight, and the relentless hum of the generators. The silence from Ramirez was a living thing. It was heavier than my armor, more oppressive than the heat. I found myself wanting to fill it with anything, with useless chatter about the weather, about food, about home. But the words wouldn't come. What could I say to him? Words were the weapons I had used to tear him apart. I poured a cup of lukewarm coffee from my thermos, the bitter steam rising in the cool air. I held it out to him. Coffee. He turned his head slowly. He looked at the cup, then at my face. His eyes were blank, unfocused. There was no anger there, no hatred. There was nothing. It was like looking into a bombed-out building. He simply shook his head once, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, and turned back to the darkness. The rejection was more profound than any curse. I leaned back against the rough wall of the tower, the splintery wood digging into my back. The wooden cross in my pocket felt like a shard of ice against my thigh. I had taken a man who believed he was protected by the hand of God and left him utterly, terrifyingly alone in the universe. I told myself it was for the good of the platoon, a necessary act of command. But here, in the suffocating quiet of the long night, that justification felt thin and rotten. I had seen a light in him, a naive, dangerous light, to be sure, and my first instinct had been to snuff it out because I could no longer stand to look at it, because it reminded me of something I had lost long ago. It was Chun who broke the spell. Movement, he murmured, his voice flat. West sector, 200 meters. My training took over instantly. I snapped my NVGs down, my senses suddenly sharp, the fatigue falling away. What do you got? Can't tell. Behind the wall. Thermal shows one heat signature. Staying low, I swung my rifle to the west, finding the crumbling wall in the ethereal green glow. Ramirez, you got eyes on? Silence. Ramirez. I hissed, my voice ablade. I looked over. He was still staring straight ahead, unmoving. He hadn't heard Chun. He hadn't heard me. He was gone. A cold dread washed over me. This was it. The liability. The ghost with a rifle. I moved to him, grabbing his shoulder and physically turning him toward the west wall. Wake the fuck up. We have a possible tango. 200 meters, your sector. His eyes blinked, slowly, as if coming back from a great distance. He raised his rifle, the movement sluggish, clumsy. I don't see anything, he stammered, his voice rough from disuse. Get on your optics, I ordered, fighting to keep the rage and fear out of my voice. On the radio, my voice was calm. Tower 4 to Watchtower. We have a single individual, unknown intent, moving west of our position. Monitoring. For a full minute, the world was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Chin remained locked on the target, his breathing steady. I kept my own rifle trained on the wall, my finger resting on the trigger guard, my eyes darting between my sector and Ramirez. He was fumbling with his optic, his hands shaking slightly. He was useless. Worse than useless. He was a distraction. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the heat signature was gone. Signature's gone, Chin reported. No longer see him. Probably just a local taking a piss, came the bored voice from the command post. Keep your eyes open for Roger, Watchtower. The tension drained out of the tower, leaving a caustic residue. My hands were slick with SW. Eat. I turned to Ramirez. He had lowered his rifle and was looking at the ground, his shoulders slumped. He was ashamed. Good. Shame was an emotion. It was better than the void. Next time, I said, my voice dangerously low, you hear a call, you react. You don't check out. You don't go on vacation. You stay here. You do your job. You understand me. He nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. I turned away from him, my gut churning with a mix of fury and guilt. Miller was right. I had broken him. I had taken a soldier and turned him into a child who needed his hand held. We stood in silence for another long time. The false dawn was beginning to stain the eastern horizon, turning the black sky to a bruised purple. The call to prayer began to echo from the village, a mournful, alien song in the half-light. Then I heard his voice, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. Why? I turned. He was looking at me now, really looking at me, and his eyes weren't empty anymore. They were filled with a terrible, desolate pain. Why did you do it? He asked, his voice cracking. In the market. Why did you say that? The moment I had been dreading and, on some level, craving. The reckoning. I could have given him a simple answer. Asterisk, it was for the good of the platoon. It was to keep you focused. Asterisk, but he deserved more than that. I owed him the truth, no matter how ugly. Because it was a lie, Ramirez, I said, my voice as quiet as his. Maybe the wind blew. Maybe that guy was a bad shot. Maybe it was just dumb, blind luck. But it wasn't a miracle. And it wasn't me. You don't know that, he whispered, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Yes, I do, I said, stepping closer. Out here, you can't afford to believe in miracles. You can't afford to believe in saviors. All you can believe in is the man next to you. In his training. In your training. You believe in your weapon, and you believe in the odds. Hope is a poison here, Ramirez. It makes you careless. It makes you wait for God to save you when you should be saving yourself. I took a breath, the words tasting like ash. I saw you all looking at me like I was something special, like I could keep the bullets away. And I saw you starting to believe it more than you believed in your drills. Sooner or later, that was going to get one of you killed. And I couldn't let that happen. I would rather you hate me and be alive than love me and be dead. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the terrible logic of my words washing over him. The anger in his face slowly dissolved, replaced by a profound, bottomless confusion. He looked like a boy who had just been told the entire world was a fiction. So you crushed him, he said, his voice barely audible. For me, the irony was a physical blow. In trying to destroy his faith in me, I had inadvertently replaced it with something far more complicated. I did what I thought was necessary for my soldiers, I said, unable to meet his gaze. I looked out at the rising sun, which was now painting the dusty fields in hues of orange and gold. The cost of it, that's mine to carry. He didn't say anything else. When Galloway and the rest of the relief team arrived, We passed on the report and descended the ladder. The walk back to the tent was just as silent as the walk out, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the jagged pieces of what I had said. As I stripped off my gear, I saw Ramirez from the corner of my eye. He wasn't staring into space. He was methodically, precisely, cleaning his rifle. His hands were steady. His eyes were focused on the task. I hadn't fixed the watch. I hadn't even found all the pieces. But as I watched his hands move with a purpose I hadn't seen since the alley, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had found the first gear. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight on my soul felt just a little bit lighter. It was no longer the weight of a pariah. It was the weight of a leader. A long, hard road stretched out ahead, but at least now, it was a road I could see. Chapter 8. The Ticking of the Watch. The sun rose with a brutal, indifferent glare, baking the previous night's chill out of the air and replacing it with the familiar, suffocating heat of another day in the belly of the beast. The walk back from the mess hall was a return to the schism. The men still parted for us, but the aversion in their eyes had been replaced by something else, a wary curiosity. Whispers had surely slithered through the tent, carrying the bare facts of the tower watch, the hushed conversation, the change in Ramirez's demeanor. They were watching us, waiting for the next scene in a play they didn't understand. I ignored them. My focus was on the patrol roster. 3rd Platoon had a route through the eastern sector, a sweep of the same village we had been watching all night. It was a milk run, usually. A chance to show the flag, kick up some dust, and remind the locals we were still there. Sergeant Miller caught my eye as he pinned the list to the briefing board. My squad was up. Of course it was. Keep it tight, Vance, he'd said, his voice low. I don't want any more drama. No drama, Sergeant. The words felt hollow even as I said them. Gearing up was different this time. The silence in our corner of the tent was still present, but it was no longer sepulchral. It was a working silence. As I cinched the straps on my plate carrier, I watched Ramirez. He moved with a newfound economy, his motions crisp and certain. He checked his magazines, inspected his optic, and field-stripped his rifle for a final check, the pieces clicking back together with practiced ease. He was still quiet, but he was no longer absent. He was a machine being brought back online, system by system. When we formed up by the strikers, the late morning sun was already a hammer. The air shimmered above the gravel. The rest of the squad fell into place, their movements tight, their faces grim. They looked at me, then at Ramirez, then back at me. They were a circuit waiting for a current. All right, I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the idling engines. Standard patrol formation. Chun, you're on the 240. Ramirez, you're my point man. A few heads turned. Appointing Ramirez to the point, the position of highest risk and highest responsibility, was a statement. It was a loaded round chambered in front of the entire squad. I saw a flicker of something in Ramirez's eyes. Not fear, but a dawning comprehension. The weight of the world, or at least this small, violent corner of it, was being settled back onto his shoulders. He simply nodded, his jaw set. Roger, Corporal. The patrol was an exercise in tension. We moved down the dusty, sun-bleached track, the village rising up before us like a collection of broken teeth. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down, leaching the strength from our limbs. IES buzzed in lazy circles. A dog barked, was silenced. Every curtain window was an enemy sniper, every pile of rubble a potential IED. This was the razor's edge we lived on, the space between suffocating boredom and sudden, violent death. Ramirez moved like a predator. His head was on a constant, fluid swivel. His rifle was up, indexed on his shoulder, ready. He wasn't the automaton from the tower, nor the wide-eyed, true believer from the market. This was something new. He was all focus, all training. He flowed around corners, scanned rooftops, and marked danger areas with hand signals that were sharp and unambiguous. He was doing his job. He was believing in his training. I stayed a few paces behind him, my own senses stretched to their limit, but a part of my mind was an observer. I was watching the outcome of my terrible experiment. I had taken God away from him, and in his place, I had given him this lethal, all-consuming present, this state of grace that could only be found moments away from death. We were halfway through the village, in a narrow street flanked by crumbling two-story mud brick houses, when the world dissolved into noise and pressure. The blast came from our left, from a garbage-strewn alleyway. It wasn't a massive explosion, but it was close. The air punched me in the chest, and the sound was a physical blow to my ears. It was a pressure plate IED, designed not to destroy a vehicle, but to maim and kill men on foot. Shrapnel screamed past my head like angry hornets. Dust and filth erupted, blinding us. Contact left. I roared, the words torn from my throat as I dropped to one knee, bringing my rifle up. The shooting started immediately after, a cacophony of AK-47 fire from the windows above the alley. They had been waiting for us. A coordinated ambush. Training took over. The years of drills, the endless muscle memory, slammed into place. "Galloway, you're hit," someone screamed. Through the settling dust, I saw him. The cherry-faced kid from the tower. He was down, clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his fatigues. He was out in the open, in the middle of the kill zone. "Chun, suppress that second-story window. Everyone else, return fire. Find cover." My orders were a string of clipped barks, the only clarity in the chaos. The squad responded. The heavy thud of Chen's M240 joined the fray, chewing chunks out of the building's facade. M4s cracked, brass casings glittering as they spun through the dusty air. I needed to get to Galloway, but between us was a 10-meter stretch of open ground being stitched with automatic fire. It was a suicide run. My mind raced, calculating angles, fields of fire, the seconds it would take. Too long. "Ramirez. On me," I yelled. I looked for him, and my blood ran cold. He wasn't firing. He was standing near the mouth of the alley, partially shielded by a corner, staring at Galloway. For one terrifying, heart-stopping second, I saw the ghost from the tower. The hollow man. The vacant stare. He's frozen, I thought. My God, I broke him completely. The fury and guilt that surged through me were so powerful they nearly choked me. This was it. This was my fault. This was the cost of my lesson. But then he moved. It wasn't a flinch. It wasn't a panic. He took one deep, visible breath. His eyes, when they flicked to meet mine for a fraction of a second, were not empty. They were blazing with a terrifying, cold fire. A fire I recognized. It was the fire of a man who has accepted the odds and chosen to act anyway. He didn't say a word. He didn't wait for an order. He dropped his pack, shedding the weight. He looked at the second-story window spitting fire. He looked at my position. He looked at the open ground. He was doing the math. Then he turned to me and gave a short, sharp nod. It wasn't a plea for guidance. It was a declaration of intent. He understood. All you can believe in is the man next to you. Before I could even process it, he burst from cover. He didn't run towards Galloway. He ran parallel to me, towards the enemy, firing his M4 from the shoulder in short, controlled bursts. It wasn't a wild spray of panic. It was a deliberate, violent act of suppression. He was drawing their fire, making himself the target, creating a window. "Vance, go!" he roared, his voice raw, powerful. The bullets that had been chewing up the ground around Galloway shifted, now snapping at Ramirez's heels. It was all the time I needed. I sprinted, the world narrowing to a tunnel. I grabbed Galloway's drag handle, adrenaline giving me inhuman strength, and pulled him back behind the meager cover of a burned-out cart. "I got you, kid. I got you." I grunted, my hands already moving to his leg, finding the wound, applying the tourniquet and cranking it down until the bleeding slowed. The firefight raged for another 2 minutes that felt like 2 years. Ramirez had found better cover and was laying down methodical, accurate fire, calling out target positions. He wasn't a zealot fighting for God. He was a rifleman fighting for his brothers. He was saving me by doing his job. The rest of the squad, galvanized by his actions, fought with a renewed ferocity. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped. They knew they'd lost the element of surprise. They were gone, melting back into the labyrinth of the village. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The only sounds were Galloway's pained groans, the frantic chatter on the radio as I called in the medevac, and the harsh, ragged breathing of men who had just stepped back from the abyss. I looked over at Ramirez. He was kneeling, reloading a magazine, his hands steady. He had a long gash on his cheek where a piece of shrapnel or a ricochet had kissed him. He caught me looking, and for the first time since the market, he met my gaze without a trace of emptiness. There was no worship in his eyes, no hatred. There was just a shared, grim understanding. We were both alive. That was all that mattered. The trip back to the FOB was a blur of dust and diesel fumes, the drone of the Striker's engine a lullaby to our frayed nerves. Galloway was stabilized, already on a helicopter heading for the hospital at Bagram. He would live. Back in the tent, the atmosphere was transformed. The men moved around us, their eyes filled not with judgment or suspicion, but with a quiet, profound respect. They had seen it. They had seen a broken man reforge himself in the crucible. They had seen a leader's impossible choice validated in blood and cordite. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the FOB, I found Ramirez by himself, cleaning his rifle. The scene was the same as the night before, but the meaning was entirely different. I walked over, the wooden cross in my pocket feeling heavier than ever. He didn't look up as I approached, his hands moving with the same focused precision. I stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, no longer oppressive, but comfortable. You didn't have to do that, I said finally, my voice raspy. What you did for Galloway. For me. He stopped, sliding the bolt carrier group back into the upper receiver with a smooth, metallic click. He looked up, his face smudged with carbon and dirt, the cut on his cheek a stark red line. You said it yourself, Corporal, he said, his voice quiet but clear. You believe in your training. You believe in the man next to you. He paused, looking down at his clean weapon. I'm a soldier. You're my squad leader. I did my job. He had taken my ugly, painful lesson and made it his own. He had found a new kind of faith, a harder, colder faith, born not in a church but in a dusty, blood-soaked alley. A faith in the things you could see and touch, the steel of your rifle, the grit of your squad leader, the courage of the man to your left. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, splintery cross. I held it out to him. This is yours. He looked at it, lying in my palm. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Ramirez, a shadow of pain for a belief that was now lost to him. Then he shook his head, a small, final gesture. No, Corporal, he said, and his eyes met mine, steady and sure. You keep it. You're the one who needs to believe in miracles. He stood, shouldered his clean rifle, and walked away, leaving me standing there with the cross in my hand. He was right. He had his faith now, a tangible and deadly one. I was the one left with the impossible burdens of command, with the ghosts of the choices I'd made. I had shattered his miracle to save his life, and in doing so, had perhaps damned a part of my own soul. I closed my hand around the cross, the wood digging into my skin. The watch was not fixed. A man like Ramirez would never be the same. I hadn't put the pieces back together. I had simply shown him how to build something new from the wreckage. Something stronger. Something that would keep ticking in the dark. And as the leader of these men, as the man who carried their lives in his hands, I knew that had to be enough. It was the only miracle I had any right to ask for. And so we leave them there, in the relentless heart of the Al-Kharid Valley, under a sun that offers no judgment, only light. We leave Corporal Vance with the weight of his choices and a splintery wooden cross in his hand. We leave Private Ramirez, a man reforged, his faith not lost but transformed from a fragile, heavenly hope into a hard, earthly conviction in the man next to him. The story of the dust of Gethsemane is not a simple one. It doesn't offer easy answers, because faith, true faith, is rarely forged in places of ease. It is born in the crucible of our deepest fears, in the moment when our own strength has utterly failed us, and all we have left is a cry into the void, a desperate scream into the dust. What was the true miracle in Alcarat? Was it the sudden, inexplicable gust of wind that rose like a shield, a pillar of cloud in a modern-day desert? Perhaps, but perhaps the greater miracle, the one that truly defines the power of prayer, happened later. It was the miracle of a broken man choosing to stand up again. It was the miracle of a leader making a terrible, soul-wrenching choice not for his own comfort, but for the lives of his men. It was the miracle of courage found not in a divine sign from the sky, but in the grim, determined eyes of a brother in arms. God's answer to our prayers is not always a gentle whisper or a blinding light. Sometimes his answer is a heavy grace, a blessing that comes with a burden, a deliverance that demands a sacrifice. Vance prayed for protection, and he received it. But that grace came with the weight of leadership, the cost of a young soldier's innocence, and the profound responsibility to see him through the darkness that followed. It teaches us a powerful lesson. Sometimes, when we pray for strength, God gives us burdens to carry so that we may build it. When we pray for wisdom, God gives us complex problems to solve. And when we pray for deliverance, sometimes God makes us the instrument of that deliverance for someone else. Perhaps your battlefield looks different from Corporal Vance's. Perhaps your Alcarat Valley is a hospital room, a courtroom, a lonely apartment, or the quiet desperation of a struggling family. Perhaps your enemy isn't a hidden sniper, but a creeping illness, a financial crisis, or a profound sense of doubt. In those moments, when your own strength is exhausted, when your faith feels as thin as a worn-out canteen in the desert, remember this story. Remember that prayer is not always about neat and tidy solutions. It is about connection in the chaos. It is about finding the courage to take the next step, even when the path is obscured by dust and fear. It is about understanding that the most profound miracles are often the ones that happen inside of us. The transformation from fear to resolve, from brokenness to strength, from a hollow man to a brother's keeper. We want to extend our deepest, most heartfelt thanks to you, our incredible audience, for joining us on this journey. It is because of you that we can continue to explore these deep, often difficult stories of faith. You are more than just viewers. You are a community of believers, seekers, and witnesses to the incredible ways that prayer can move in our world, even in the most unlikely of places. Your presence here, your comments, and your shared experiences breathe life into this channel and remind us that none of us are alone in our struggles or our triumphs. If this story of trial, leadership, and a heavy, transformative grace has moved you, we humbly ask for your support. Please, take a moment to subscribe to the Prayer Miracles channel. By subscribing, you become a vital part of our mission to share powerful testimonies that strengthen faith and offer hope in a world that so desperately needs it. You won't want to miss the other journeys we have planned, each one a unique look into the heart of faith and the reality of miracles, both big and small. Click that like button to let us know this story resonated with you. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Corporal Vance's choice? Have you ever experienced a heavy grace in your own life? A blessing that also came with a profound responsibility? Your testimony is a light to others, and we read every single one. Finally, if you know someone who is walking through their own Alcarat Valley right now, who feels pinned down and out of options, please share this story with them. You never know how a single story of hope and resilience can be the gust of wind that provides the cover they need to keep moving forward. Thank you once again for your time and your heart. Until we meet again for another story of faith and deliverance, may your own prayers be heard. May you find strength in our trials, and may you always have the courage to be a miracle for the person next to you. God bless.